Hello there. I'm Rebecca, 28 years old and recently married to Richard, a man 7 years older than me. But let's rewind a bit. Let me paint a picture of the day Richard and I first met. It was at one of those fancy garden parties our parents loved to throw. I was 18, fresh out of high school, and Richard was 25, the new hotshot in his father's company. I remember him walking up to me, a glass of champagne in one hand. "Rebecca, right?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I've heard a lot about you." I blushed, not knowing what to say. "And you're Richard. I've heard a lot about you, too." He laughed, a sound that made my heart flutter. Hopefully all good things. We spent the rest of the evening talking, laughing, and to my surprise, connecting on a level I hadn't expected. It was that night that our parents, seeing us together, got the idea of us getting married. It took a few more years, but eventually their plan came to fruition. Before we got married, we signed a prenup. It was a simple deal. If one of us cheated, the other got to call it quits and walk away with $3 million. I had no plans of straying, so I signed without hesitation. I remember the day we signed that agreement. My dad, a man of few words but with a heart as big as an ocean, looked at me with concern in his eyes. "Are you sure you're okay with this, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with worry. "Dad, it's fine," I reassured him, giving him a quick hug. "I trust Richard and he trusts me. This is just a formality." Richard was there too, and it was he who insisted on signing this paper. "I don't want you to feel like you're being cornered, Rebecca," he said, his voice a little strained. "If you're not comfortable with this, we can discuss it more." But I just shook my head and smiled. "Richard, I'm fine with it. I trust you." He seemed relieved and gave me a warm smile. "And I trust you, Rebecca." That was the start of our journey. We got married in a grand ceremony that was the talk of the town. I was excited about this new chapter in my life, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. After the wedding, we moved into a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city. It was a dream come true, living with Richard and waking up next to him every morning. He was sweet, caring, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. Our honeymoon was like something out of a fairy tale. We spent 2 weeks at a beautiful beach resort, soaking up the sun and enjoying each other's company. But when we came back home, things started to change. Richard became a different person. He was distant, always lost in his thoughts. He would come home late from work and go straight to bed without even saying goodnight. We started sleeping in separate rooms, eating at different times, and barely spoke to each other. One day I decided to confront him. "Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what's going on? You've been acting strange ever since we got back from our honeymoon." He looked at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth they once had. "I've just been busy with work, Rebecca," he replied, not meeting my gaze. "But we barely talk anymore," I pressed on. "We're living like strangers in our own home." He sighed, running his fingers through his hair. "I know, Rebecca. I'm sorry. I'll try to make more time for us." But things didn't change. If anything, they got worse. Richard started coming home even later, sometimes not until the early hours of the morning. He stopped eating with me, and we barely saw each other. I started having suspicions. Was he seeing someone else? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore the signs. I decided to confront him again. "Richard," I said one night when he came home late, "are you seeing someone else?" He looked shocked. "What? No, Rebecca. I would never do that to you." "But you're always out. You never spend time with me," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I told you, it's just work," he said firmly. "I'm not cheating on you, Rebecca." But I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. Richard was not the man I had married. He was distant, cold, and seemed to be hiding something. I didn't know what to do. I loved Richard, but I couldn't live like this. I decided to do some digging. If Richard wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I would find out for myself. I started by checking his phone when he was in the shower. I felt guilty about invading his privacy, but I was desperate for answers. I didn't find any suspicious messages or calls, but I did find something that made my heart drop. Richard had been searching for apartments. Was he planning on leaving me? I confronted him about it. "Richard, why are you looking for apartments? Are you planning on leaving me?" He looked taken aback. "No, Rebecca. I was just looking. I wasn't planning on leaving you." "But why were you looking?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know, Rebecca," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I need some space." One day I decided to talk to my mom about it. She's always been my rock, my go-to person when things get tough. "Mom," I said, "I don't know what to do. Richard's changed. He's not the same person anymore." My mom listened, her face full of concern. "Rebecca," she said, "you're both still adjusting. You're newlyweds. It takes time to build a life together." I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was just a phase and things would get better. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Richard was hiding something. I could feel it. I tried to shake off the feeling, tried to convince myself that Mom was right, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like a nagging voice in the back of my mind, constantly reminding me that something was off. A few weeks later, I gathered my courage and approached Richard. "I need a job," I said, looking him in the eye. He looked surprised. "You want to work?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I nodded. "Yes, I need to do something, Richard. I can't just sit at home all day." He thought for a moment, then said, "I can offer you a job at my foundation. We help kids in tough situations. Would you be interested?" I was taken aback. Richard's foundation was well known for its work with children. I had always admired the work they did. "Yes," I said without a moment's hesitation. "I'd love to." Working at the foundation was a breath of fresh air. I was busy, doing something meaningful. I met kids who were strong and resilient, kids who had seen more hardships than any child should. It was heartbreaking, but also inspiring. The job kept me busy and kept my mind off the problems at home. Richard and I had our issues, but at least during the day I had something else to focus on. The work was tough, emotionally draining, but it was worth it. I felt like I was making a difference, doing something important. For the first time in a long time, I felt happy. But even then, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. Richard was acting strange and distant. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was wrong. I was determined to find out what it was. Left with a whirlwind of questions and a heart heavy with betrayal, I decided to hire a private detective. I needed to know if Richard was cheating on me. It wasn't just about my pride, it was about my peace of mind. I couldn't live in the shadow of doubt, constantly wondering what went wrong. And then there was the prenup we signed before we got married. If Richard was cheating on me, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was a costly mistake. I found a detective agency in the city run by a man named Joe. He was an ex-cop, a grizzled veteran with a keen eye and a no-nonsense attitude. I told him my story, my suspicions, and he listened, his face impassive. "I'll do my best, Rebecca," he said when I finished, "but I can't promise anything. If your husband is cheating, he's doing a good job of hiding it." I nodded, understanding. "I just need to know, Joe. One way or another, I need to know." I remember the day he came to give me his report. His face was serious, his eyes sympathetic. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," Joe said. "I couldn't find any evidence that your husband is cheating on you." I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me was glad that Richard wasn't cheating, but another part of me was frustrated. If he wasn't cheating, then why did he leave? What was he hiding? "Are you sure, Joe?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing at all." Joe shook his head. "I'm sorry, Rebecca. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. I thanked Joe and paid him for his services. As I watched him leave, I felt a profound sense of loss. I was back where I started, with more questions than answers. I was working at a charity fund event when he walked in. His name was Daniel, the new guy. He was handsome, with a charming smile that could light up a room. He was smart, with a quick wit and a sharp mind. He was funny, with a sense of humor that could make anyone laugh. In short, he was my ideal man. But as much as I was drawn to Daniel, I couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. His arrival seemed too perfect, too convenient. I couldn't help but think about Richard and the prenup. If I was caught cheating, I would have to pay a hefty sum of $3 million. Could Daniel be a trap set by Richard to catch me in the act? I decided to hire Joe again, the private detective I had used to investigate Richard. I asked him to look into Daniel to see if he had any connections to Richard. Joe agreed to take the case. He started investigating Daniel, digging into his past and his connections. He followed him, watched his movements, and monitored his interactions. He was as thorough as ever, leaving no stone unturned. In the meantime, I tried to keep my distance from Daniel. It was difficult, especially since he was so charming and attractive. But I had to be careful. I couldn't afford to fall into a trap, not when so much was at stake. One day, Daniel asked me out for coffee. I was torn. Part of me wanted to say yes and get to know him better, but another part of me was scared, worried about what Joe might find. "I'd love to, Daniel," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I'm really busy right now. Maybe some other time." Daniel seemed disappointed but didn't push. "Sure, Rebecca," he said, his smile dimming slightly, "some other time." I felt a pang of guilt. What if I was wrong? What if Daniel was just a nice guy and I was letting my suspicions ruin a potentially good thing? But I couldn't take the risk, not until I knew for sure. A few days later, Joe came to give me his report. His face was serious, his eyes hard. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he said, "but your suspicions were right. Daniel is working for your husband." I felt a rush of emotions: anger at Richard for trying to trap me, relief that I hadn't fallen for it, and sadness that Daniel wasn't who I thought he was. But above all, I felt a sense of vindication. I wasn't crazy, my suspicions were valid. "Thank you, Joe," I said, my voice choked. "You've done a great job." As I watched Joe leave, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had dodged a bullet, avoided a costly mistake, but I had also lost something: the image of the ideal man, the hope of finding love again. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I wasn't going to let this get me down. I was stronger than that. I was going to move on and find happiness again. I didn't need an ideal man, I just needed someone real and honest, and I was going to find that person no matter what. I could have sent Daniel packing right then and there, but I decided to take a different route. I chose to play along, to befriend him, all the while making sure to keep my behavior above board, not giving Richard any reason to point fingers at me. Daniel, however, took my friendliness as a sign of something more. He started to loosen up, thinking he had me charmed. The irony was he was the one getting played. But I didn't let Daniel in on the secret. I couldn't risk him running back to Richard, so I kept up the act, maintained the friendly facade. One day I decided to up the ante. I asked Daniel to join me for lunch, making it sound like a casual discussion about charity work. He agreed, a smug smile plastered on his face. He thought he was making progress. We found a quiet spot in the cafe. "So, Daniel," I began, "how are you finding the charity work?" He shrugged, a confident look in his eyes. "It's good. Different, but good." "And Richard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you think of him?" Daniel looked surprised. "Richard? He's okay, I guess." "Why?" I shrugged, attempting to look casual. "Just curious. He's a bit of an enigma, isn't he?" Daniel laughed, clearly relieved. "Yeah, he can be a hard one to read." We continued to chat about work and life. I made sure to keep my tone neutral, not giving him any reason to be suspicious. In the days that followed, I continued to play along, keeping up the friendly act and making sure never to cross the line. I was always on guard, always careful. It was a risky game, but one I was willing to play for now. One day, during one of our lunch meetings, Daniel looked at me with a serious expression. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. A chill ran down my spine. "About?" I raised an eyebrow. He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "About us, about this thing we have." My heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment I had been dreading. I forced a smile. "And what is it that we have, Daniel?" He looked at me, hope in his eyes. "I think we have something special." Guilt washed over me. Daniel was falling into my trap just as I had planned, but it didn't feel right. It didn't feel good. Still, I had to keep up the act, keep playing the game. I smiled at Daniel, a fake smile plastered on my face. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We do have something special." Just like that, I had set the trap. The game was on, but at what cost? The Cold War at home with Richard was as icy as ever. We'd occasionally run into each other, exchange chilly greetings, and retreat to our separate corners. Most nights, he'd be at his apartment, claiming it was more convenient for his work commute. One Sunday afternoon, I dialed Daniel's number, lacing my voice with a warmth as fake as his documents, inviting him over to my place. He probably thought I was finally ready to give in to his advances. Poor guy, he couldn't have been more wrong. As Daniel stepped into my home, he was greeted not by a seductive housewife, but by my old classmate, now a stern-faced police officer. He'd agreed to help me out, and the surprise on Daniel's face was worth every bit of it. The officer checked Daniel's papers, and as expected, they were as fake as a $3 bill. Now it was time for my move. I offered Daniel a choice: stick with Richard and face the consequences of his fake documents, or switch sides and work for me. His eyes darted between me and the officer. After a moment of silence, he nodded. He agreed to my deal. Checkmate, Richard. With that, the real game began. I had Richard's pawn now playing for my side, but I knew this was just the beginning. Richard was a crafty man. He wouldn't go down without a fight. In the days that followed, I kept a close watch on Daniel. Despite his agreement, I knew I couldn't fully trust him. He was a wild card, a potential threat, but for the time being, he was useful. One day, I summoned Daniel to my office. "We need to talk," I said, my tone serious. He looked at me, a hint of unease in his eyes. "About what?" "About Richard," I replied. "I need to know everything, his plans, his strategies, everything." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll tell you everything I know." Just like that, I had my insider. My counterattack was ready, but this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. Richard wouldn't go down without a fight, and I had to be prepared. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was war. And in war, there are no rules, only survival. Days turned into weeks, and I was getting antsy. I wanted to confront Richard, to show him I wasn't the pushover he thought I was. Joe, whom I turned to once again, had given me some advice. "Push Richard," he suggested. "Make him think you've fallen into his trap." It was a gamble, but I was ready to play the game. So Daniel and I staged a photo shoot. We posed in ways that could be seen as compromising, as proof of an affair. But we were careful. We kept the originals, where everything was as innocent as a Sunday school picnic. Once the photos were ready, I gave them to Daniel. "Give these to Richard," I said, handing over the envelope. "Let him draw his own conclusions." Daniel looked at me, concern etched on his face. "You sure about this?" he asked again. "Once you start this, there's no going back." "I know," I replied, a steely resolve in my voice. "And I'm ready." The very next day, Richard was all smiles at dinner. He thought he'd caught me, that he'd gotten one over on me. But he didn't say a word about it. I wasn't worried. I knew it was coming. I was ready. Meanwhile, Joe was on the case. He was digging up dirt on Richard, finding all the evidence we needed. He was good at his job, and I trusted him. Finally, Joe called. Richard had relaxed and let his guard down. "I've got him," Joe said, his voice rough with satisfaction. "I've got all the proof of Richard's cheating, photos, videos, the whole shebang." I felt a rush of excitement. "Good," I said, a smile spreading across my face. "Let's bring him down." But I didn't confront Richard, not yet. I wanted him to think he was winning. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized he'd been played. So I waited. I played the part of the dutiful wife, waiting for Richard to make his move. I knew what was coming and I was ready. The clock was ticking toward the family dinner. I knew this was it, the showdown. I felt a strange calmness. I was ready. The dinner was at Richard's parents' mansion, a sprawling estate that reeked of old money. Richard was there, of course, playing the doting son and husband. But I knew the truth, and soon everyone else would too. We were halfway through the main course when Richard cleared his throat. He stood up, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I have something to say," he announced, his eyes on me. He pulled out a set of photos of me with Daniel. He tossed them on the table like he was playing a winning hand. "Proof," he said, his voice filled with triumph, "of my wife's infidelity." The room went quiet. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't flinch. I was ready for this. I calmly stood up, meeting Richard's gaze. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I know this man, but he's not my lover. He's an actor hired by you, Richard, to frame me." I pulled out my phone and hit play. The room filled with Daniel's voice, confessing everything. Richard's smile faltered, his eyes widened in shock. But I wasn't done. I pulled out my own set of photos and videos, evidence of Richard's own affairs. I tossed them on the table. "What about these, Richard?" I asked, my voice cold. "Can you explain them?" Richard stammered, trying to deny it, but the evidence was undeniable. His parents' faces turned to stone. My parents, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "You ungrateful brat," my father roared at Richard. "We trusted you with our daughter, and this is how you repay us." Richard's mother was in tears. "How could you, Richard?" she sobbed. "How could you do this to us?" took her. The aftermath was swift. We divorced. Richard's parents, furious at their son's deceit, fired him from their company. His reputation was in tatters. And me? I walked away with $3 million in compensation. Now Richard is jobless, scrambling to pick up the pieces of his life. And me? I'm free. I'm enjoying the peace, the silence. I'm enjoying my life without Richard. I won. I took on Richard and won. I outsmarted him, played his own game better than he did, and it feels good. It feels right.